Okay, we're recording.
All right, thanks everybody for showing up. As Mike mentioned, I'm Jeff Swetland. I'm the technical account manager here at Ingram for the Aruba portfolio. And really wanted to talk to you today about switching. A lot of different changes have happened over the recent few years. And if you really look at the changes that are going to happen over the next 5 to 10 years, we really have to look at the switching architecture in a totally different way. And so I'm going to share with you kind of what's going on in the market. I'm going to share with you some of the important features that your customers are looking for within the switching portfolio. And then I'm going to turn it over to John, and John's going to share with you a demo of some of the Aruba management capabilities within Aruba Central and some of the reasons that your customers are looking at Aruba from a switching perspective and ease of management perspective. So what's going on in the marketplace? The biggest thing that's going on in the marketplace over the next 5 to 10 years that you really want to be hyper focused on is around IoT. Now, most events that you're going to attend, most seminars that you're going to go to, most webinars that you're going to attend are probably going to have something associated with IoT. And really what IoT is going to do is it's going to change the way that businesses run their business. It's going to make that business be more efficient, be more green, be able to monitor their infrastructure and to do better maintenance on those things. There's going to be a lot of new initiatives that your customers are going to have. And so one of the things that you need to focus on is, as you communicate with your customers, is to really understand what those initiatives are, those IoT style initiatives. And instead of having a discussion around servers or storage or networking and, do you need a new device and, how much throughput do you need? That conversation is kind of fading away, and it's really around these applications like IoT that are really transforming their business. And so smart buildings are probably the easiest one to understand. Almost everybody who moves into a new facility has some type of green initiative, and they want to do some smart building initiative where maybe within the air conditioning, they do some smart stuff with that. There's sensors and monitors and controls in there that can turn things off at night, turn things off on holidays when people aren't using it. Not just air conditioning, but lighting, and there's security cameras and all kind of other different things, right? So the office environment has fundamentally changed, probably similar to the way that your house has probably changed, right? 10 years ago, you probably didn't have much more than a couple of laptops at your house. It's pretty common today that people have camera systems that are at their front door, that they have smart thermostats that are there, maybe smart appliances, many different initiatives where there's kind of a smart building initiative at your own house, right? So offices are also doing those type of things. And if you think about your evolution at your house, where you went from a few devices, if you scan your network today, you probably have dozens of devices. And so as you increase the number of devices and as you increase the throughput, you also need to maybe change out the infrastructure. And so the switching architecture that we're going to talk to you today is part of that rollout, right? So as customers are adding all these new smart devices and now we're adding video cameras on the network, and we're doing these type of Zoom sessions on the network, we need more throughput. We need more capabilities, and it demands a different architecture from an infrastructure perspective. So smart IoT is kind of one phase of it. If the customers you're servicing are in the manufacturing process, this is one of the initiatives that's going to be huge in manufacturing. So there's sensors on everything up and down the assembly line. The devices that are working in there all have sensors to see, what the temperature is, how long that they've been in use, so that they can do preventive maintenance associated with it. As things roll down the line, they can scan it. When boxes come in, they can put a sensor on it and start to really get good information of how long it takes from the inventory that comes in, the raw materials, until that raw material stuff goes out the door, so they can get a better understanding of their inventory and the turnaround associated with it. So there's lots of great analytics that they can start to see in the manufacturing facilities, which helps them to run their business better. Smart cities. If you're working with your local cities or state governments, they probably have done some smart initiatives. Maybe when they did a refresh with first responders, maybe they did a IoT style initiative for that. Maybe it was with the police force, public safety, some of these other different things that are out there. But what we're starting to see now is they're starting to look at it more from a big holistic view of getting all these things rolled across all the departments within the city. And so instead of just having maybe one or two of the departments have certain IoT initiatives, we're seeing it citywide. And this is really kind of changing the way that they're going to run and manage the city itself. And for places that are not big cities, we're starting to see it quite a bit in agriculture. So there are plenty of IoT sensors that you can put out in these fields, and those IoT sensors can monitor things like humidity, heat, temperature, all these other different things. And then based on those sensors, they can program those things that if it goes to a certain temperature and it hasn't rained in the last 48 hours, then turn on the sprinkler systems for 2 hours, as an example. And so there are ways of doing kind of this smart farming, if you will, which is enabling these farmers to get a higher gain and better crops from their fields by using IoT sensors. So these are just a few use cases, but your customers that you're talking to are really looking at a lot of different use cases. And so this is one chart. If you go on Google and just do a search for IoT market, for the next 5 to 10 years, basically within the next 5 years, the IoT devices and the infrastructure is going to double. Now, the current stuff that we have on the traditional customers you service, so the traditional stuff being laptops and servers and printers and those type of things that businesses normally run on, it's going to grow by single digits. But the IoT sensors and devices that I'm sharing with you are going to more than double. So how do we build an infrastructure that's going to be able to support doubling the number of devices on it, right? So this is a picture of Phoenix, and I lived out there in the late 90s, early 2000s, when Phoenix was the fastest growing city in the US year after year. And you turn on the news, and part of the buzz of the city was how it was growing, how there was a new development that just got built, how there was a new resort that just got built, how there was a new shopping district that just got built, how these new restaurants are now in that city. And, for those that maybe didn't, a lot of the California restaurants were coming into Phoenix, and a lot of the Northeastern West restaurants were coming into Phoenix. So there was all this great buzz about growth. And then there was this period of time where the cities and the suburbs also, where they stopped giving out building permits. And for about 2 weeks, they had these developers that would be on the local news talking about how they got denied permits. And so they showed the city council meeting. And basically what the city council said was, we've denied all permits because we can't build the infrastructure to support all this new growth. So they couldn't build the streets fast enough, the police force fast enough, the fire departments fast enough, the schools fast enough to support the explosion of growth. And so the reason why I'm sharing with you this story is most of your customers are going to go through the IoT initiatives that I shared with you in the previous slides. That's going to happen. That makes business sense to them. That's going to help them run their operations better. What we need to do is we need to build the infrastructure today to be able to support twice as many devices, to support mostly wireless devices that are going to get connected to the infrastructure. These new IoT devices are going to need some different security requirements. And so one of the things that you can do in your consultative sales approach is to have that discussion with your customers now. Find out what they have from a Ethernet switching infrastructure today. And do they have what's going to be required from an infrastructure perspective to be able to support these IoT rollouts that are coming over the next couple of years? And so as the infrastructure has changed, the requirements for the switching architecture has changed also. So if you've been in this industry for a while, like I have, 20 years ago, there was no wireless. You'd go into a customer, you find out how many devices that they wanted to connect, and then you created a solution based on the number of switching ports required to connect those devices to it. Today, more devices are connected wirelessly to the network than they are wired. And so the switching products that we sell customers have to be fundamentally different, because now we're plugging in access points into those Ethernet switch ports. And instead of one device connected to that switch port, I might have dozens of devices connected to that access point that's plugged into that switch port. So the throughput is totally changed. That switch now has to have a higher availability, because it was a 48 port switch before, and I only had user connections connected to it. The switch went down, maybe I lost 48 ports, 48 devices. If I've got 48 access points connected to a switch, and each access point has dozens of connections to it, if that switch goes down, I've lost more than 1,000 devices are now down because that switch is down. And so the requirements start to change of how we talk about switching. And the other thing that you really need to understand is that when we sell a new switch today, most customers are going to have that switch in their infrastructure 5 to 7 years. That's the general life cycle, 5 to 7 years. So part of what you have to do as a consultative seller is to not just be looking at what their requirements are at this moment, but really what you're looking at is 5 years from now, what are the requirements that they're going to need? And like I showed you in the previous slides, with all these IoT initiatives that are happening, you're basically going to need twice the horsepower of what they need today to support the twice as many devices that are coming. And so Switching architecture has really changed. I'm going to talk to you about a couple of the things that your customers are looking for as they replace the switching architecture. And so switching today is Ethernet, right? So most customers today buy gigabit Ethernet switches. So it's a 24, 48 port switch. Most of them are 48 ports, and most of them have standard power over Ethernet at 30 watts. And then those switches, they used to have 1 gig uplinks. The common one today is 10 gig uplinks. So picture a 48 port gigabit PoE switch with 10 gig uplinks. But what we're seeing, and what we need to have a discussion with the customers, is as you buy this new infrastructure that's going to be in your network 5 to 7 years, maybe we should be looking at faster throughput than 1 gig. Right, so there's a newer technology that I'm going to talk to you about on the next slide called Smart Rate. You might have heard of it as multi-gig, or some other different vendors have a different marketing term associated with it. But instead of 1 gig, we have ports that now will do 1 gig, 2.5 gig, 5 gig, 10 gig as your regular RJ45 ports on the front of the device. We're also seeing a transition to go from 10 gig uplinks to 40 gig uplinks. From the wiring closet to the core or the aggregation switches. And a lot of the bigger core type switches we're seeing go from 40 gig to 100 gig. So as we're having conversations with our customers, one of the things that is important to have the conversation is, you know, how much bandwidth do you think that you're going to need over the next 5 years? What different devices and applications do you think are going to be required on your network so that we can get you the right switch ports? So this is the slide around multi-gig, and this is that newer technology that enables us on those RJ45 ports on the front to not only support 1 gig, but also to support 2.5 gig, 5 gig, and 10 gig connectivity. Most of the ports today are 1 gig, 2.5 gig, and 5 gig. And they can use their standard, you know, Cat5, Cat6 type cabling. So that's great news. The next slide, I'm going to talk to you about power over Ethernet. And there's some new PoE that can go here. But one of the biggest drivers for this multi-gig technology is that the access points have gotten to a throughput of more than 1 gig. And so those 8 access points need more than a 1 gig connection to them. Right, so the new Wi-Fi 6 stuff that you're selling has the ability to do multi-gigabits of throughput from the AP to the switch. And so this is a technology that enables us to take that same cable run, put in a Wi-Fi 6 AP, put in one of these switching products with this multi-gig capability, and on that same Ethernet cable that maybe you were running, you know, an older access point at gigabit speeds, now I can take that same cable, run this at multi-gig, maybe 2.5 gig as an example, and put a Wi-Fi 6 access point in there and double my throughput of Wi-Fi, and plug it into this new switch port that supports the multi-gig capabilities. And so multi-gig is one of the technologies that are things that we should be having a discussion with your customer about. The second piece is around power over Ethernet. So in the mid-2000s, power over Ethernet really started to become something to talk about. As we were rolling out voice over IP, those IP phones needed a power over Ethernet connection or a brick in the, you know, that you'd plug into the wall. And so power over Ethernet became kind of a technology of choice for people that were doing voice over IP rollouts. Access points, you know, started getting IP connectivity with PoE. So we started rolling out, access points in addition to phones, and then many other devices now are connected with Power over Ethernet. So the early ones were 15.4 watts. That was the first technology that was out there for PoE, or Power over Ethernet. The devices that started to come out needed more than 15 watts, and so they went to PoE Plus, which is 30 watts. Now, this is what most customers have out there today, and most of the switches that we sell today are 30-watt devices. The newer technology is now going to 60 watts. These new Wi-Fi 6 access points that we have, there are some of them that require more than 30 watts. So we either have to make 2 cable runs with the 30-watt connections, or we can make 1 cable run with the 60-watt connection. And there's a number of devices that are coming out that are going to be required to do PoE with 60 or more watts. So in the future, you're going to be going to your desk and just plugging in an Ethernet cable, and that Ethernet cable can provide power to power your laptop. So no longer are you going to have to carry around your laptop adapter and plug it into the wall through your USB-C type connector. You'll be able to get it powered through the PoE connection. So that's just one application that's out there. So the point on this slide is most customers today are already buying PoE switches at 30 watts. But in the future, most of your customers are probably going to need some ports that do 60 watts of power to support these new Wi-Fi 6 access points, or maybe some of these new higher end devices for Power over Ethernet. So from a basics, there are typically 2 main types of switches. So the one I'm showing you now is a chassis-based switch, right? And in a chassis-based switch, you buy the chassis and then you add all the different modules and power supplies and fans and everything to it. These devices have always been used at the core of the network. It does give more flexibility on the port options. So for example, most of those 24 and 48 port switches have, fiber uplinks, but they're not really good for fiber aggregation. They're not real flexible if you need it. So many of these 25 gig ports and so many of these 10 gig fiber ports and these 100 gig interfaces. So if you really want to customize and really have a switching platform that has all the ports that you really need, sometimes you have to go to a chassis-based platform and put in the modules that have the ports that you need. And so chassis are one solution from a switching architecture that we look at. Now, they're also the most redundant. So we can put in redundant management modules at the top. The modules themselves are hot swappable, which means while the switch is up and running, I can slide out a module. If that module had an issue, I could take a spare and put it in there and slide it in, and everything would still operate. And I could put in the new module, plug in the cables, and everything would be operational without having to take the switch down. So there's my high availability. On the backside, there's normally redundant power supplies, redundant fans. So once again, it's providing a high level of redundancy. These switches are generally more expensive. However, as we start to take a look at more and more devices and applications that are becoming more, that have higher requirements for uptime, sometimes chassis are a better solution to kind of meet the availability requirements of doing your 99.999 type of redundancy. So chassis are one platform. Another platform is going to be your traditional 1U high type switches that are generally 24 or 48 ports. Now, if you look at switching products, you're going to see a number of these, and that's what this slide is really just designed to be. There are some switches without power over Ethernet, and those are perfect for maybe devices that don't need PoE. Maybe it's a device that you're plugging in all your docking stations that just need a regular Ethernet connection for a laptop, and they don't need PoE. Some switches have regular PoE at 30 watts, and that's the most common one and what most people use. Some of these switches have the newer technology that allow us to do class 6 or 60 watts of power. And maybe for these new access points that require that, maybe those are ones that we look at. Some of these ports are gigabit. Some of these ports have the capability of doing that smart rate that I shared with you, where there are ports that can do 1 gig, 2.5 gig, 5 gig. And the switch on the top left is a 10 gig fiber aggregation switch, right? These type of switches support a technology called stacking, right? Or virtual stacking, where you can take these switches, connect them together, and from a management perspective, it looks like one big switch stack as opposed to managing many different switches. But we can take these and put them in a combination. So for example, we might put the high-end switch with the multi-gig capabilities and 60 watts. We might buy one of those, plug our access points into those, buy a regular PoE switch for our IP phones, and buy a non-PoE switch for desktop connections. And we can stack them together and make one solution. Okay, so there is a way of doing this. I just wanted to show you that there are different options when it comes to switching based on what the customer's needs are. The other thing that's kind of changed is on the left side, switching in the good old days just had an integrated single power supply. But as I shared with you, as you add more access points, as you have more devices that are connected into these switches, redundancy becomes much more important. So in the middle, you see a similar switch that now has redundant power supplies and redundant fans. And so it might make sense, if you had those 3 switches I talked about in the last example, the switch that you have that has the multi-gig and the 60 watts of power for these new Wi-Fi 6 APs, maybe that switch we need to have with redundant power and redundant fans. Maybe that 48 port non-PoE switch that we're plugging desktops into, maybe that doesn't need to have redundant. So we can have a redundancy model based on what we feel is that important. But what's changed is, when the customer last bought these switches, they were probably all integrated single power supplies. And what we should have a conversation with them about is, it might be best practice to put new switches in with redundant capabilities, redundant power supplies, redundant fans, to give them higher availability as their needs grow. And we can put in a single fan and a single power supply to start off with. And then maybe when they do the IoT rollout 2 years from now, part of that rollout is we add the redundant fans or redundant power supplies to those switches to be able to handle the additional redundancy needed for those devices. The other thing that you're going to see is traditional switches that I shared with you are normally going to be in the wiring closet. And so in the wiring closet, the airflow goes from side to side. There's also switches that you're going to sell that are going to have airflow that goes front to back or back to front. So port to power or power to ports, or those type of things. Because in a data center switches, you're going to have aisles of data center switches, and the airflow there is going to be front to back instead of side to side. So there are some different switches out there that are going to support data center architectures, similar to what you see here. You probably have heard the terminology top of rack switch. So this is where that comes from. So in a data center, you might have a 19-inch rack that's filled with servers or storage type of products. And at the top of that 19-inch rack, you generally have a pair of switches. where you have redundancy. So the slide's trying to show you that we have one connection in orange that's going to one switch and another connection in green going to a second switch. So we have high level of availability. So if we had a situation where a switch went down, we've got another switch that's on the top of the rack that's active and transferring data, so our applications don't fail. And so you probably have heard of top of rack switches. A couple other things to think about when you're selling these switching solutions, there are other pieces that are part of this. So those fiber uplinks, you're probably going to sell your customers the transceivers, right? The 1 gig, 10 gig, 40 gig, 100 gig transceivers that are going there. There are direct attach cables that are part of this architecture that you're going to want to sell and make sure that you provide those with the solution that you have. Then I see your question, and when I turn it over to John, I'm going to have John answer your question. So let me just do a couple more basic slides, and then I'll transfer it to John. So Aruba does have a switching architecture called Aruba CX Switching. This is really the next generation of switching architecture that's out there. There's been a lot of development to make it active, so that you can do things like switching software upgrades. You do software upgrades live without taking a device down. John's going to show you some of the Aruba Central network management piece on there. We do have some really cool security technologies. It's things like dynamic segmentation, where we can connect these switches with our Aruba ClearPass platform to do things like authentication and push policies to that switch port, so that when a device connects to the network, that it can, it gets a policy pushed to it. And that way, from a security perspective, that device only goes to where we want it to go to. And then there's some cool stuff with network analytics engine and some other things that are part of this platform that really make it a much easier platform to manage, configure, maintain, those type of things. So these switching products can get managed the way that switches have always been. So there are many network admin people that love the command line interface or the CLI interface. You can manage all of the Aruba switches with that common CLI commands. The Aruba switches also have a built-in web interface. So you just type in the IP address of the switch, and there's a web interface, and it's a good-looking interface, and it can configure a lot of the common stuff that's out there. John's going to show you Aruba Central, and he's going to show you the platform that Aruba hosts. But the solution that John is showing you, Aruba also sells a version of that called Central On-Prem. So if you want the management software that John's going to show you, but you not want it running on a local server as opposed to buying a software subscription and having Aruba hosted in the cloud, Aruba does offer that. And one other piece is Aruba does have a software package called the Fabric Composer. So if you're doing data center applications and you want to build within the data center, maybe a layer 2 architecture to do vMotion, the Fabric Composer will enable you to take a look at those switches that are in the data center, those top of rack switches, the big core switches as an example, and in essence, use this tool to create a fabric across those in a very simple process. So you can associate what ports you want to be part of that fabric, and then the management tool will push the configuration to those switches, and it makes the configuration a whole lot easier than going and manually configuring every individual switch that's up there. So last couple slides. Here's the portfolio. The cool thing about the CX portfolio is it does go from the smallest little 12-port layer 2 switch at the edge all the way up to the biggest campus switch, top of rack data center switches, big core switches. We do have ruggedized switches now. So the 4000 series are ruggedized switches. And the new 10,000 is a totally different switch platform altogether. So if you've done data centers in the past, you probably have gone into the data center, and in that data center, you had those top of rack switches. But then when traffic was going between the servers, they often would have to go through firewall type products, load balancing type products, right? There's a number of different application things that happen between servers. This CX 10,000 switch has those core application things that happen in a data center in ASIC. So instead of having the data center having switching, firewalls, load balancers, all those type of things, picture all of that happens in this switch in ASICs in line speed. So it makes the architecture much simpler, much faster, and to make it easier to manage. And these products that I'm showing you, we can go from the smallest little layer 2 edge switch all the way up to the data center. All of these products can be managed in Aruba Central, which is the cloud platform that John's going to talk to you about. And so most of the competitors that Aruba has, if you want cloud managed products, they generally have a switching portfolio for cloud managed products. And that portfolio is different than their campus switches. And their data center switches, they're a different technology, a different switch series, a different operating system. So they have hardware and software for cloud managed, hardware and software for campus switches, hardware and software for data center switches, with different management tools to manage them independently. And what Aruba's done here is they've got one architecture, the same CX operating system from the entry-level switch to the biggest data center switch. It's the same OS, the same command line interface, same management of everything through the cloud portal in one easy architecture. No licensing, those type of things. So Aruba's really made it simple for customers. The last couple slides that I'll show you, these Aruba switches, the data center switches, are now part of the other HPE server storage architectures. And they're now, there's white papers and best practices on how to integrate the HPE server storage with these switches. If your customers are looking at some of the other models of software of a service, which is what John will show you with the Aruba Cloud platform, or they want to buy the Aruba networking solution as network as a service, Aruba does have a Green Lake offering, where if your customer wants to do it that way, we can sell them that network as a service. From a leadership perspective, there's lots of great customers that are out there. As you're watching the Golden State Warriors in the NBA championship, their brand new state-of-the-art facility is all Aruba. There's a great use case out there if you want to see what that looks like, but there's many great customers that are buying it. I think the one thing I'll share with you around this is there's been more than 1 billion switch ports that HP Aruba has sold, right? So this is not a small portfolio. This isn't, this isn't a startup company that you have to sell. Why Aruba, right? Aruba is a market leader and has been for decades in the switching architecture. And there's more than 1 billion ports that are out there. There's the Gartner Magic Quadrant where Aruba's been in the top right for the last 16 years straight. So from a third-party validation, we can get you that. And the switching architecture is part of the bigger story within Aruba which is the Edge Services Platform, or ESP, right? So at the bottom level where you have your infrastructure pieces, switching is part of this, and it complements, the wireless access points and SD-WAN products and other things that are out there. With that, I'm going to pause and transition this over to John, and maybe John and I can take a couple of these questions as we transition. So, John, I'm going to stop sharing and let you.
All right. Go. Can you guys see my screen here? Is that a yes? Is that a no?
I can see it, John.
All right. All right. So now we're going to spend the rest of the session going over command lines. No, that'd be boring, wouldn't it? Oh, my goodness. Nobody. But, if you're an engineer, maybe you have engineer staffs, they've lived kind of in this putty. So my story that I want to give you is, let's think outside this. So certainly things like show interface brief and show run are things that we all know and love, but this never sold anything, right? This is kind of table stakes in the marketplace nowadays, right? And I want you to think beyond the box, to say, and think about different capabilities. So what sells nowadays, right? Cloud certainly sells. Analytics certainly sells. Certainly full solutions sell. Connecting solutions end to end sell quite a bit. And that's really what I want to kind of talk to you guys about. So I'm going to show you a few different pieces. So let me open up my web browser here. We're going to go over it. So this is the local management interface that Jeff had talked about on an Aruba CX switch. And that's actually the same switch that I have right here. All right. But how much easier is it to use this, right? So I can tell real quick that I've got fan issues, and obviously we can use things like SNMP and stuff like that, right? But quickly from looking at this, I can tell I've got kind of issues. That doesn't happen over here, right? When I look at this page, I get a vast amount of information that's useful to me quickly in the environment. So I certainly would like to point that out. And this is and I can modify this as well. So for example, I have this PC over here, Mr. Grumpy Cat, we'll call him. And he's connected to port 2 inside our environment. You can see this port's up. All right, but I could certainly manage from this interface, take ports up and down. Certainly I could create VLANs, but there's more to this, I think. And that's really, I think, what the analytics section of this does. Now, what I'm going to show you maybe is a little bit nerdy, but I want you to think outside the box of what could be, especially when Jeff was talking about the IoT type of devices. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop in a script into this thing real quick. So I'm going to upload something very fast. All right, happens to be a Python script. So if you got anybody on your staff that does Python, they can do this. But if you don't, I'm going to talk to you about how you can do this. So this script is brought up here, and actually we're going to create what I would call an agent out of this. So let's add our agent. Call it our grumpy agent. Now, what this does is this is going to detect a certain threshold of activity, and it's going to shut off the port cold and hard inside our environment. And actually, I can monitor that if I go back up to analytics over here, and I could add this into this environment. I just wait for it to light up. All right, so I could add this, and we can watch this. Now, again, I want somebody to be able to do their work, for example, in their environment. So I want them, well, maybe not so much their work, but we could certainly see we could surf to Amazon. We certainly see that we can use this connections. We can go to Macy's if we want to. All right, Wikipedia would be a little bit more helpful in life, but what I'm going to use now is I'm going to abuse my connection a little bit. Netflix makes this thing called fast.com, and it's to test your bandwidth coming down to your PC. I'm going to run this a couple times, and if this goes well, it's probably going to trigger off an error underneath down here. So we'll wait for this to complete, and I'll come back and do it again. Next, it probably takes a couple times in order for this to happen. If we set this up right, there we go. We can see the staff happen. And if you can't tell from here, but I'm clicking on the start menu and this happens. So my session has been shut off, and That's kind of been popping up. And actually, if I look inside the interface, you can see the interface is down. So this is just, well, I guess my point of this is external factors could have an effect on my switch configuration, right? Could this have happened if, say, I don't know, say a hacker got in your environment, grabbed your database and started dragging it across the internet to their location? Can you detect that and shut down that port? Certainly you could do something like that, right? Could I set this up if I wanted to say, hey Alexa, create me VLAN 80, create me VLAN 20, shut down port 2. Yeah, I don't know how useful that would be, but I could certainly do that. But my point is we're moving beyond this box, and we're connecting to other devices and having things happen to our switch configuration. So that's one way I want you to kind of think about it, is, again, think outside this box. Another way is kind of where we're looking at the cloud perspective, right? And Aruba Central. So let me get into Aruba Central. I'm going to come back to this page as well. So within Aruba Central, we can get a great amount of analytics on different devices. And this is, a lot of this has to do with wireless, but I'm getting a lot of great information within my infrastructure. But again, nobody buys a switch because I want to switch. They're supporting a full solution within their environment. And again, Jeff's example, it might include a lot of IoT type of devices or networking. And we might want to check on those things on an ongoing basis. So if I actually go under, let's see, network health, right, and we're going to go, let's see, I'm going to let this refresh. We're going to go over here. You see that something's going on with a site, right? And I got a user experience insight sensor. So this is another option that you can add that integrates on this, again, going beyond the box. And this can come up, and this acts like a little robot on your network and tests the end-to-end connectivity and resources. Again, nobody buys a switch because they want to switch. They've got an application that's out there, and if that application doesn't work, what's causing the problem? Well, this tests that on an ongoing basis. And granted, I've got a captive portal issue here, but other things are important. Ethernet connections and VLAN, DHCP, gateways, right? DNS, those type of things can be checked on an ongoing basis to make sure our applications are up running. Can this check your sensors that are out there in your IoT? Certainly. Can those sensors do something and have you interact with the switch? Certainly you could do things like that, right? So Aruba Central is very powerful. Another thing with cloud-based management is I can manage holistically. So for example, say you're putting Aruba switches, I don't know, say you got a McDonald's contract, and you're going to put a switch in every one of the McDonald's stores, on the face of this earth. And there goes our remote desktop session. It finally cancels out. So you're going to do that. Well, I would be willing to bet that each one of those locations are going to have somewhat of a common configuration, and maybe they have a VLAN that connects them back to the corporate office. And you always want that configured in that way. Well, we could do that through groups. And these are groups of devices that you would configure singularly within an environment. And granted, what's going to come up here is I'm going to have one switch within this environment, but I could have tens, hundreds, thousands all across the globe. And I could go in and create things singularly that can span across the globe. So in this case, going back to my example, I need a connection, McDonald's maybe needs a connection back to the corporate office here. And I've got VLAN 86, and it's going to exist across all devices. And there's certainly going to be other things that you'd want to config in that fashion. But I could also, obviously, each one of these stores that are out there, you're going to want to change that config to match what the store's needs are. Or, even in this, you could create a guest wireless access policy that if somebody plugged in, right, they would get a guest splash page, and that would be, common across the environment. But we're kind of dealing with the networking piece here. So I could go into the individual switches, and again, I just have one here, so I'm going to select that. So we're going to change our group from this business transformation center group to this switch group. All right, and then I can go down to the devices that exist, right, and I could do a configuration on. So again, interfaces, and then you could see that this individual switch has a lot more VLANs over here. Not only do they have that 86 VLAN that it's set up for every device, but I have other things. So I can configure individually if I want to. And that's kind of the power of the cloud and being able to manage those things. So again, I want you to think bigger and larger than just this. And if you've been doing Aruba Central for a while, you'll notice that there was a new login, right? And you get this new banner up here called Green Lake. Right, and I'm going to click on that. And this is kind of where I started our discussion when I kind of moving into Aruba Central is this. So certainly traditional GreenLake that we've thought of as kind of a costing model or a pricing around on-prem hardware with thoughts of cloud in mind, meaning you pay for what you utilize on a monthly basis. And I'll say I'll call that GreenLake Central nowadays, and we can look into that. And certainly Aruba has been brought into that fold as well. Again, getting on-prem networking equipment, paying for what you utilize on a monthly basis. That's happening in this moment. But that's one aspect of being a managed hybrid IT like the cloud. Now, again, nobody buys a switch just because they're buying a switch. They're buying end-to-end solutions in here, and certainly GreenLake Central is one of the ways to go up the costing model, but there are other ways, day-to-day maintenance of these solutions, and certainly Aruba Central is the oldest piece within this GreenLake model, and I showed you where we can manage switches and devices in there, but it's much larger than that, and this is the overall GreenLake vision. The overall GreenLake vision is managing hybrid IT as if it was the cloud. So not only can we do networking these days, we can also do compute ops, would be like managing client servers from within the cloud. So again, if I have servers across the globe, I could do things like update firmware on those systems, right? Just the way we could do with our networking equipment within Aruba Central. Right. Data Services Cloud Console is managing on-prem storage systems from across the globe. Again, I can have one storage system or many everywhere. Creating things like volumes and presenting those to VMware hosts or backup strategies. There's a backup strategy that's managed in the cloud. These are updating and getting modified on an ongoing basis to offer new features and functionality. And we can even talk about InfoSight, the other AI analytics for the hybrid IT, right? But all this together makes a full solution for your customers and your environment. Again, thinking outside that one box that kind of exists. And this is kind of the messaging that I want to get to you is, again, let's think outside this black box, this PuTTY or SSH terminal in here. And let's think of full solutions with our infrastructure, taking our individual devices and managing external or managing things holistically from within the cloud. So that would be my rant for today. So I'll hand this back on over to Jeff or Mike.
Hey, John, so we got a couple questions, and I'm going to pull something up, and I'm going to have you answer this question while I pull it up.
Okay.
Which airflow is the most common, front to back or back to front? Can you kind of share with the group around data center stuff with front to back or back to front airflow and when they get used?
Yeah, I would say they're both equally as popular, but you want to think about where your ports are or where your hot and cold aisles are. So you want to do front to back if your switch ports are in the front, because generally speaking, your hot aisle is usually in the front of your server rack. And then the back is usually a cold aisle that comes up. But a lot of people will mount their switch ports on the back of the system because they're closer to like the ports that would be on a server. In that case, would want back to front type of area. Because again, generally speaking, the front of the rack, where the server faces are, is the hot aisle and the cold aisle is in the middle. But it really comes down to what's your hot aisle and what's your cold aisles as far as how you want to set those up. So there isn't one answer. It's just a matter of style and how the data center is set up. And they're both equally as popular.
Yep. There was a question around the switch selector. Are you guys able to see my screen?
I can see.
I can, yes.
Okay. I'll put in this link. I'll put in the link into the chat, but there is a switch selector that's available. So if you click on the link, we talked about fixed ports. So fixed ports are going to be these like 24, 48 port switches. There are modular switches. So we talked about kind of the chassis style switching platforms. And, there is the Aruba products, Flex Network, Flex Fabric are out there. Office Connect is more the SMB portfolio. So if we select the Aruba one, we can go by different port counts. Do I want a 24 port switch? Do I want a 48 port switch? Right. And then from that, I can take a look at some of those things I shared with you. Or do I just want 1 gig uplink or ports? Do I want smart rate ports? You know, different configurations of these. So if I go back to 1 gig, you know, I got a few different options that are going to be out here. I can go into, let's do 48 ports, right? Do I want 10 gig uplinks for fiber? Do I want 40 gig uplinks? Do I want switches that have redundant power, redundant fans, you know, that type of stuff, support stacking? And so this is a nice little tool that a lot of resellers use to kind of narrow down maybe different switches that are out there based on maybe some of the core requirements that are out there that the customer has provided. So, and we can kind of do a similar thing with the modular switches where we can, you know, should have a port count there. Anyways, you can do a similar thing with the modular switches, you know, with the ones that are out there. So this is a great little switch resource to maybe narrow down what switches that you may want to look at for the customer themselves. Yeah, I agree with you that the switch selector doesn't necessarily show all those things. Aruba does have a tool that's called Iris, and within the Iris tool, the switch selector is part of the Iris tool. So the visors, you can go into switch selector here. And it's similar, but the Iris tool is a little bit more updated. So I would share with you if you're looking for some of the switches, your engineers probably are using this Iris tool, and I would maybe have them to maybe take a look at the Iris tool to get more updated info on some of the switching that's out there. So I think that might have been the different questions that are out there. Can you get access to Iris? You can definitely get access to Iris, and let me get the link for this. We'll do this. When we send out the update, I'll have that included. But there's a company called Intangi that makes Iris, and you basically request access to it. It's free. They normally, you know, you'll fill out your first name, last name, and email address type of thing, and then they'll send you a link to have access to the Iris tool, typically within 24 hours.
So Jeff, you're going to be able to get the information on how to access it, and then we'll just push it out to the people on the
Yep.
call. Okay, great.
Yep. I believe that might have been the items in chat and Q&A. So,
I think so. I don't know if anybody else has any other questions. We're a little bit over time, which isn't an issue for me, but I know it may be an issue for some other people on the call.
So John and I will wait here with Mike for maybe another moment or two. For everybody else, we appreciate you joining the webinar. We will send you the slides, and I'll send you the information around the Iris tool. So if anybody else has any questions or would like to chat about anything, you know, please stay on. For everybody else, you know, thank you for joining.
Okay, I'll stop the recording right now, and we'll wait for questions. And there's a question in the chat, which I'll follow up on. So.